Hi everyone, welcome to the Roundtable. My name is Omid Daryani. I'm the Senior Brand Manager of EverQuest franchise. I'm here today with Terry Michaels, the Senior Producer of EverQuest Next, and Jeff Butler, EverQuest Next's Creative Director.
Hello everyone.
We're here today to discuss race class restrictions. Should all races have access to all classes? And this was by far our most popular, most controversial, most discussed question. Definitely the biggest one on the roundtable. And the majority of people were fine with having race class restrictions as long as it fits with the lore. I shouldn't say a majority, the plurality. Something you can learn about voting. Majorities are over 50%, pluralities are less, but they're in charge. The more you know. So something kind of funny happened here, right? We started off agreeing with the team, and this is actually the first time that our internal team is not in agreement with the roundtable. So can you talk a little bit about how that went?
Well, interestingly enough, I think philosophically we were very much in line with the votes that the players were putting forward. In our own minds, when we were thinking about what we would like to see for the game, our thinking matched what the players were laying out. Unfortunately, when we started developing the game, we realized we wanted to create a situation where our players were never forced to make a decision that they would later regret based on knowledge that they didn't have at that stage in their careers. During Character Create, we didn't want them to have to make a decision on career paths that they might later come to regret.
So you're talking about a thing like where in some games you might pick a god, right? And you don't know up front that picking that god is going to restrict some amount of things.
Right. Yes, it could, later on restrict your faction choices, and then you would find out late in the game, after you had created that character and leveled him up, that you had backed yourself into a corner. And we had effectively, as a development team, allowed you to create a character that you didn't feel was viable. Right. We decided early on, before we had addressed any of these questions internally, that we wanted to try to avoid those things. And so that led us to, in this case, not being in agreement with the players.
Right, because in our game, with the fact that we've already announced that we're going to have at least 40 classes, and with the multi-classing, when you chose your class at the beginning, your race and your class at the beginning of the game, as you chose that race, you might have to understand every ability out there and every item in the world to be able to make a choice if we did allow for race class restrictions.
Yeah, and I know for me, like, when I start up an MMO or just an RPG in general, like, I feel like I have to sit there for a half hour, 45 minutes. I have to read a wiki to figure out what all these different options mean. It almost feels sometimes like I'm doing my taxes.
Right. Well, and for the games that are out there, especially ours and the ones that are like it, it's a very clear distinction, like which races can be a warrior. But you know what a warrior is, so if you can be a warrior, you're happy with that. In our game, you don't know what other classes are going to have abilities that might augment the playstyle that you really want to create in the game. And so it'd be almost impossible for somebody, even with the wiki and a spreadsheet with all these tools available, you probably couldn't even figure out how you were limiting yourself if we had race class restrictions.
We talked about the possibility of somebody creating an ogre warrior. The ogre warrior doesn't necessarily care about the bard class. As an RPer, he doesn't even believe...
Hypothetical bard class.
Thank you, yes. He doesn't even believe, for instance, that a bard and an ogre should ever meet, right? So he doesn't concern himself. He merrily goes down his career path as an ogre warrior, and then later realizes that for his playstyle, the bard had an ability that could really help him. Right. Well, he couldn't be expected to know that when the game started. Now, if the rest of the player populace would realize that that ability is key to a warrior being successful at the current stage of the game, at that state of game maturity, then he would be disadvantaged. Whether it's his perception or reality, it's a situation that we didn't want the players to have to deal with no knowledge at all.
Yeah. And it also applies to as the game expands in the future after we've launched. If we decide to release additional classes, that's information that people wouldn't have had at the beginning of the game, and there's no way for them to have known it. So we would basically be making arbitrary decisions for who gets to play these new classes and who doesn't, and the ramifications are just the players aren't going to like that.
So players would just basically get screwed for no reason by design decisions that weren't necessarily intended to mess them up, but
Right.
just
Absolutely.
would because of the structure that we put in place.
Exactly.
Yep. Character races that might be added, character classes that might be added, and also items that modify character class abilities and things of that nature. All of the balance of those things could never be foreseen by the player on day one creating his character class. So ultimately, we don't think it's fair, we don't think it's wise for us to restrict players in those choices, because ultimately, sooner or later, someone is going to get hurt. Whether it's an issue of perception or reality, we think it's best just not to go there.
Yeah, and it blows my mind that we actually started thinking about this while this discussion was happening.
Yeah.
That, you know, when we put up the poll, that we were seeing these results come in, and we were happy because we're like, oh, that's where we're going, that's what we're thinking. And then as we went through and we're reading arguments and discussing it internally, we said, wait a second, this isn't going to work with our game.
It's a situation where the actual design and the responsibility for the life of the game and its health it outweighs the benefits and the desire as a role player and as a game player and a game crafter to actually have these restrictions, because no one looks at this and thinks that that it doesn't have a place in fantasy, right? The dwarven defender from Dungeons and Dragons, it makes sense to people, right?
Yeah, and we have ogre bards in real life. Meatloaf, for example.
Exactly.
So that's another episode of the Roundtable. Thank you guys so much. I thought this one was really interesting in that the discussion actually really changed a fundamental design direction. So we'll see you next time. Thanks very much to Terry and Jeff for their time.
Thanks, everyone.
Sony.